Hi, good evening. Welcome to Spies and Spymasters Cocktail Hour. We're looking at the Courier. We are so delighted to partner with Lionsgate and Roadside Attractions in celebration of this new film, The Courier. And I hope you've had a chance to watch this incredibly compelling movie. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for joining us here at the Spy Museum. We're so excited about this movie that's focused on the true story of Oleg Penkovsky and Greville Wynne. Penkovsky is very near and dear to our heart, or as we call him around here, the spy who saved the world. We have a really incredible group of people assembled tonight to talk about The Courier. We have the director, Dominic Cooke.
Hi, good to be here.
Hi, Dominic. He's joined by our Spy Museum historian and curator, Dr. Andrew Hammond.
Hi.
Hi, Andrew. And our beloved founding advisory board member and former CIA chief of disguise, Jonna Mendez.
Good to be here, Amanda.
Hi, thanks, Jonna. They'll each be providing some comments for the first half of the program. Then we're going to turn it over to you for your questions. Just type those in through the Q&A feature and we'll get to them later on. But first, to get us in the mood for the happy hour, we have our good friend, Taha Ismail from the Round Robin Bar. Now, that is at the Willard Hotel, which also owns the Occidental Grill, where there are rumors of back-channel conversations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We tried to break into the Occidental Grill, but they shut us down and they said, back to the fabulous, gorgeous Round Robin Bar and Grill for you. And the Round Robin is a perfect setting. I think Greville Wynne would have really liked this joint. What do you think, Dominic?
I reckon so.
Okay, great. So Taha, let's see what you're shaking up for us tonight.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us. We're here. We have the Red Scare. It's a very easy cocktail, very refreshing. This is equal parts of rum and port. First, we're going to start with the rum. We have a 10-year-old port. Pineapple juice. And some cranberry. You can either use a shaker or a mixing glass. Now it's time to add some ice. Gonna give it a quick shake. In the glass here, we're gonna coat it with a little bit of Pichat bitters.
Oh, that's so pretty.
Thank you. We're gonna add a little bit of more ice cube. And our last touch will be the fresh mint. A nice, beautiful bunch of mint goes right on the side here.
Wow.
And here's your Red Scare. Enjoy, everyone.
Oh my gosh. Cheers. Cheers to you, Taha. Thank you for cooking that up, stirring that up for us. We can't wait to have it in person with you soon. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the Round Robin, are you open for drinks?
Yes, we are. We're open this Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from 4 p.m. until midnight.
All right. If you're in Washington, get over there. Oh, thank you, Taha.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that looks incredibly fabulous. So we think most of you have probably seen the movie. We hope so. But just to kick this off, we thought we'd show you something that was made available through Lionsgate's PR team. It's a very short bit that has Benedict Cumberbatch talking just a bit about his role in the film.
Greville Wynne was a businessman, cornering kind of niche in particular market in Eastern Europe and spreading further and further east from Czechoslovakia to Hungary. And then in our version, that's when MI6 tap him, which means obviously, make an approach to work for them. And they want him to go to Russia, but he doesn't know why.
So you want me to go to Moscow and then...
do business. He's just fantastic. He's so much fun to work with. He's such a beautiful actor. He has such energy that comes through in both the biggest and the goofiest ways and in the smallest, most intimate ways. We've only shot a couple of scenes together so far, but it's been a blast. I've been such a huge fan of his work for a long time, and it's been really fun to get to watch him transform into this character.
Benedict. Oh, Benedict is just an amazing actor and person to have as your leader on set, and he's so precise and wants to kind of experience and explore something with you, which is all you ever really want to have on set. Yeah, I completely love him, and I think he's just fantastic in this.
Well, Dominic, wow. Congratulations on this wonderful film. We just really, really loved it, and it really draws you in. And I was going to ask a different question first, but that little clip, those pieces are so evocative of the way you recreated the time, even down to the camping getaway trip. Tell us a little bit about how you created this look and the feel of Cold War London and Cold War Moscow and a Cold War camping trip.
Well, I mean, there was a fair amount of research done into into those worlds and into the sort of textures of the time, and we also looked at a lot of period movies from the early 60s, and we made some sort of overarching decisions, like we tried not to have any trees or nature or green in the movie. So in fact, the scene with the that you saw in the camping trip and then the scene in the golf course are the only scenes in the movie where there's any nature at all. We wanted it to be totally sort of man-made worlds that these characters were living in. So that eliminated an awful lot of locations because there are trees everywhere. And I was like, no, we're not going there, we're not going there. So that was one thing. And then we sort of limited the palette down to quite a sort of low range of color, because we wanted to get a consistency across both Moscow and London. And we were sort of looking for modernist architecture and sort of very straight lines, very linear buildings, so that there was a sort of very sort of regimented background to the characters. And actually we tried to get that in London as well as in Moscow, although it sort of works architecturally different in London, because we were after a sort of feeling of individuals that are sort of set apart from their world. And because these two guys were sort of one-offs, they weren't one of the crowd in either of their very different cultures. So we sort of tried to reflect that visually in the choices we made.
There's so much, I think you mentioned to us in other conversations, so much monumental.
That's right. Scale was really important. I mean, it's easy to find scale in Moscow because Moscow is built like that. London's much more sort of compressed and sort of higgledy-piggledy, but we wanted to find, like, for example, where he lives, where Greville lives, we found a location where all the door colors were the same and all of the walls were the same. So there was this sense of repetition. So there was sort of a sense of a mass, if you like, of the same thing, and he was sort of separate from that. So there were various sort of visual themes in the movie that sort of work subliminally.
So
I'm very interested in the way that, stories picked up sort of without you noticing, sort of elements are picked up without the audience actually noticing them.
So what drew you to this story initially?
Well, it's a very compelling story. I mean, I was sort of amazed that I didn't know it. in the first place. I didn't know that these two guys had done this. I didn't know that they had played this incredibly important part, actually, in bringing back crucial information that affected Kennedy's decision-making in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it was actually the sort of emotional part of the film that really got to me, because I hadn't come across a spy movie where there was so much sort of emotional life. There was so much about the cost of espionage, the personal lives of the people involved. And because the main character is this sort of rookie, it allows the audience a sort of access to the experience that they wouldn't normally have. Because of course, professionals would be sort of inured to it. They'd have an armor if they went on a mission like that. Whereas we go in with him and he's like, what the hell's happening here? So he's sort of able to access it. And I thought there were lots of elements like that in the movie that I just hadn't seen before.
Well, this is when I make Jonna share something from her past that's not spy related, which is what we usually ask her to. There is this wonderful musical section as they're getting to know each other. And Jonna shared that it really rang home with her. Do you feel like remembering that for the rest of the public?
Sure. There's a moment in the film when Penkovsky is taking Wynne to the ballet, and he's never been to the ballet. And they're sitting in the office, and the frame is not on the stage, it's on them. You never see the stage, but you hear the music. And the music is just, I mean, we all kind of know that music is sublime. But there's a point in the movie, another scene, where they're playing that music in the background, and then they cut quickly and they're in London. And you know, the contrast is immediate. There's color, there's lights, and there's Chubby Checker singing Let's Twist Again. And eventually Penkovsky gets up and he's dancing. And it was just one of those moments. I actually listened closely to the music throughout the movie. I thought the use of the music was to create mood and to transition. I thought it was just, it was wonderful. But what you're talking about, structuring those shots, maybe because I've been a photographer for some years, but that's the thing I left the movie with, is how you framed those pictures, how you used that palette, that idea of those horizontal masses. It was so evocative of what Russia was back then. It was just brilliant. Thank you.
And Dominic, you also found people for intelligence geeks like us who were like, oh my gosh, who did he get to play that role? How did you go about casting these real characters and some composite characters? How did you go forward with that?
Well, I think there's always a particular challenge if you're casting a movie or a play set in another time, you know, because not everyone can sort of access that. I mean, it's a very particular thing. Britain at this point, you know, people's behavior was incredibly different to the way people behave now. It was, you know, very formal. I mean, Britain has a history, especially England, has a history of the sort of colonial rule and the boarding school, where the expression of emotion is really frowned upon. I mean, it still exists in the culture now, but it was massively important at that time, especially in these kinds of sectors, if you like. You know, the sort of world of military intelligence, the world of the military in general would have been incredibly sort of uptight. And they, you know, we needed to find people who could play that. So I was looking for people who could do that, but also have a really strong sort of emotional life. And I mean, the real revelation for me in that regard was actually Jessie Buckley, who plays Sheila, who is sort of the youngest person in a major role in the movie. And she's, as you can see from the interview, she's about as far removed from that woman as you could imagine. And yet, for me, she absolutely conjured the world of that time, that sort of incredibly restrained way of expressing herself, but she's full of feeling at the same time, which I found that sort of mix quite moving. So it was really about finding people who could sort of take us back, if you like, into that time.
Well, you did a brilliant job. And speaking of taking us back into that time, Andrew is going to give us a run through a little bit of the facts as we know it and how they tie into the Spy Museum, and a few cool collection highlights that we have that relate. we'll get back to you again, Dominic and Jonna.
Absolutely. Could we go to the first slide, please? Okay, so one of the things that I want to do is just really briefly focus in on who Greville Wynne and Oleg Penkovsky were. Dominic explores their relationship in the movie. Then I want to look at some of the artifacts that we have at the International Spy Museum. And through these artifacts, they're like a portal, an entryway into the past. So I'm going to speak about a couple of them. Then I'm going to speak about, this is a fascinating time in the history of humanity and in Cold War politics. So I'm going to speak about some of the historical backdrop. This could easily be an hour-long lecture, but if you'll forgive compression and brevity. Next slide, please. Could you play this video for me, please?
What is your name, please?
My name is Greville Wynne.
My name is Greville Wynne.
My name is Greville Wynne.
So I found this online, and I think that this is the perfect metaphor for Greville Wynne. Who exactly was he? He was caught up in, you know, major events of the Cold War. He did spend time in a prison. He did come home in a spy exchange, but then he wrote books that were almost Walter Mitty-ish, and the fact that fact and fiction were woven together, and sometimes it's very difficult to see through what the man was actually about. So Greville Wynne, you know, as Dominic said, a businessman who gets caught up in these events. He's one of the couriers for Oleg Penkovsky. He gets caught in a spy swap with a guy going by the name of Gordon Lonsdale, also known as Conan Molody. Greville Wynne came back to the UK, maybe a broken man, struggled afterwards with depression and alcoholism, and ended up being divorced twice. So a bit of a cipher, a bit of an enigma of a man. So moving on to Oleg Penkovsky. So codename Hero in the US and Yoga in the UK. He was a war hero in the Second World War. He's got a promising career, but then they find out that his father fought for the whites during the Civil War, and he sees his career come off of the rails. He's a GRU colonel, so Soviet military intelligence. He was an active agent for around a year and a half, but a very pivotal and important year and a half. And he was a volunteer spy. He's someone who sought out MI6, CIA, who sought out people to pass information onto. So I hope it's not too much of a spoiler. I hope that most of you have seen the movie already. Penkovsky, of course, dies. And one interesting fact that I found out was that he was accused of being a moral degenerate. And one of the witnesses that appeared at his trial as proof of this moral degeneracy said that he witnessed Penkovsky drinking wine out of a woman's shoe. So quite interesting moral degradation in the Soviet system. One thing that I find, just before I move on to the artifacts, one thing that I find quite interesting, and Dominic and I discussed this last week, is that in some ways these are two men that find themselves constrained and hemmed in by a system. For Greville Wynne, it's the British class system. For Oleg Penkovsky, it's the Soviet system. Next slide, please. Okay, so crucially important to this case is the Minox camera. I have one here. You can take 50 photographs with this, and Greville Wynne took a lot of photographs and passed a lot of material over and conducted a lot of debriefings. There was a lot of transcripts. There was a lot of material that was conveyed over to the West. And the Minox Camera, German camera, a model of German functionality, and it becomes quite well known during the Cold War as a kind of spy artifact. Very tiny little spills. Move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so we have this in the museum. I held it last week. It's super heavy. It's a lead box that was used to transport Penkovsky's film to make sure that it would not be destroyed or irradiated. So again, in a year and a half, probably over 100 cassettes he supplied to the West. And this box is about 2 inches by 2 inches, but you could get quite a lot of these cassettes in there. Move on to the next slide, please.
But Jonna, did you want to comment on using the Minox a little bit?
Just briefly, the Minox was commercially available. Anybody could buy one. It did become famous as a spy camera. It became famous at my house as a ski camera because if you fell on it, it wouldn't penetrate you with a long lens. It was noisy, that camera, and it required two hands to do it. So it was cumbersome for Cumberbatch. It was cumbersome. Later, we gave him a proprietary camera that you could put in a fountain pen and just sit at your desk and just take picture after picture after picture. Your boss would come in, you could just start writing with it because the pen worked. We didn't have many tools for him. That camera, though, he put it to work. He produced volumes, like Andrew said, lots of stuff, 5,000 pictures and more.
And I can give viewers a quick demo of the noise of the Minox. That one's not so good, but you can maybe hear it, and it does take 2 hands to do it.
Yeah.
Move on to the next. Sorry, stay on this one. Okay, so this is a Kgb surveillance photo of Penkovsky that we have in the museum. So in spy parlance, he's rolled up in 1962 around October. So I just want to leave you with that date, that month, October 1962. Move on to the next slide, please. And here we see some more of the surveillance footage. Next slide. Okay, so we come back to the museum, and this is a place where we explore the psychology of Kennedy and Khrushchev. So just very briefly, I'm just going to give you a kind of historical backdrop to the Penkovsky and Greville Wynne relationship and to the movie. So I just want you to think about this period in time. So 1959, the kitchen debate. So a sort of pugnacious debate between Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev is seen as being quite bombastic and reckless. And in fact, he ultimately gets removed from his role as a result of that. Of course, John F. Kennedy comes into office saying, you know, we are a nation that's been tempered by war and conditioned by a hard and bitter peace. So we're talking about a really interesting moment in time. Around this period as well, the Berlin Wall goes up. So even more tension, even more at stake during this time period. Of course, around this time period as well, part of the backstory of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so October 1962, is the Bay of Pigs. So an operation that Kennedy inherits, and it doesn't go well, but this is also feeding into this whole series of events. So why does Greville Wynne, why does Oleg Penkovsky matter? Well, one of the main areas surrounding the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Penkovsky supplied important information that allowed Kennedy and his advisors to make important decisions, to have as much information as they could. Move on to the next slide, please. And as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so, almost nuclear war, a hotline is set up in 1963. Of course, the same year Kennedy dies, but it's a way to try to ensure that the superpowers could communicate. So Moscow and Washington. And this is a piece that we have in the museum at the moment, on loan from the National Cryptologic Museum. Next slide, please. And this is here. I don't have time to go into it, but if you're around the DMV, please come and see it. There's some fantastic artifacts here. Next slide, please. This is a great one. So the launch sites on Cuba, and Penkovsky helped analysts make sense of what they were and what was going on. Next slide, please. This is a cipher. This is Penkovsky outlining to the KGB after he gets captured some of his tradecraft. Next slide, please. And this is also in the museum's collection. And I'll just close off here and hand off to Jonna. And here's one of Greville Wynne's books, Contacting Gorky Street. You can see one man facing one way and one facing the other. And in the Penkovsky papers, we see him coming apart. Again, I think those are interesting metaphors for both of those men.
Thanks, Andrew. Really, we love that image of the missile sites. It's used in the Cuban Missile Crisis educator resources that we have available for teachers, and do lots of workshops where people try to make sense of the kind of intelligence that Penkovsky shared with us. So very, very dear to our heart. And Jonna, folks have been asking exactly what you knew I was going to ask you was, is this what Moscow felt like? You have a recent book that you wrote with your beloved husband, Jonna Mendez, The Moscow Rules, talking about how intelligence officers had to operate in Moscow. And a significant part of the early, I think the second chapter of the book is about how the Penkovsky case affected how you all operated. So how did Dominic do at conjuring this up?
He did really well. I mean, the mood, the atmosphere, the tension, the Moscow was a city of surveillance. That was the major issue. If you were a spy going to be assigned to Moscow, you were going to be surveilled everywhere you went, everything you did, whether you were in our embassy or in your apartment, in your car, or on foot. They were with you and watching you. It was just an overwhelmingly oppressive environment, in addition to the weather, which was cold and gray, and it was not a great assignment. It was, but it was one of the most important assignments that we could give to one of our officers, because we needed to collect intelligence, and that's where it was. The KGB surveillance were trying to shut us down. We were trying to get information for our policymakers. That was the huge conflict. The Penkovsky case, when it arose, showcased so clearly. In the movie, they say we were a little thin on the ground. We were like a baby organization. We didn't have any tools. We didn't have really much tradecraft. So we went to MI6 in Moscow, who had been doing this, Dominic, you probably, I don't know, forever. They'd been running spy operations. We called them the cousins. And so they agreed to partner with us in running this incredible case. The dilemma in Moscow was in passing the information. We didn't have any clandestine tools. My office was the Q for CIA. We performed that same function. We developed the technology. We trained people in how to convey material back and forth. Because if you can't pass it, you got nothing. And if it takes you a month to pass it, it's not even intelligence anymore. Now it's news. So it doesn't count. So we went on a tear for about 10 years, developing clandestine communication systems for our foreign agents. We I want to say it was an unwritten rule, but it probably was written somewhere. We all agreed that we could not meet after Penkovsky. We could not meet with foreign agents in Moscow face to face. It was too dangerous. They would be identified, they would be arrested, they would be executed. So impersonal communications became the name of the game. That's everything from how you collect the information, and that our small Tropel camera was huge step forward from the Minox. You could put the Tropel in anything, it was so small, and walk away with 100 pictures. We did radio broadcasts from Europe in ciphered communications. So Penkovsky had a code sheet and a one-time pad that he tore up after each communication. It was really tedious work to receive a message. It was one way. He could not send us a message. Then we had a series of dead drop devices, signals that meant, oh, we've dropped the dead rat at site A. And he would put up an X on a lamppost that said, I got your signal, I got the rat. You know, it could be a greasy construction glove. It could be a fake brick. It could be anything. And inside of it, we'd have microfilm, fresh film for his Minox, instructions for what we're looking for, and instructions for where the next drop would be. That is a labor of love to run an operation without face-to-face, eye-to-eye. It's hard to do. It's hard to keep people motivated. He was so motivated that we almost couldn't stop him or even slow him down at the end. When it started looking like maybe they were onto him, he just photographed more and got it to us. Not only the Cuban Missile Crisis, the thing about Berlin, that the wall was going in, he had information that they were going to put that wall up. It happened almost overnight. He had no way to transmit that information to us. So he had the intelligence, but he couldn't send it to us. My office, OTS, we did using everything from disguise to clandestine cameras to all kinds of magic tricks out of Hollywood so that we could slip away from our surveillance and put down a drop or mail a letter and come back, and they wouldn't even know we were gone. We just invented a whole new way of doing spy business, tradecraft. It was, he turbocharged us. He only worked for us for 16 months before they arrested him. But it was the information, the intelligence that we received from him took years to get through, to get it translated. They had teams of people working on it in London and in Washington, DC. And long after he was gone, we're still, processing the information, the missiles, the programs, the future that he was showing us where they were headed. It was an incredible operation. One of the most significant ever. And what he wanted was to save the world. And he did. It would have been nice if along the way they had realized the history that they were making. I like to think they knew.
So there are so many questions, and that right there leads into one of them that has been asked by a number of people. Did Penkovsky know that he had saved the world? We get to see him find out in the movie, but do we think he found out in real life?
I'm pretty sure he did, because there was a show trial on television that was way after the missile crisis was over. I mean, there wasn't a nuclear war. I think he knew that much. So I think he probably did know. Yeah.
And so people want to know, did they meet again? Was there any chance that Penkovsky and Greville Wynne met in prison?
Well, there are two things that did happen. One was that they did meet because they met in a trial. I mean, my understanding of the trial, it's hard to get to the sort of truth of any of it, but reading between the lines of Greville Wynne's books, which, you know, as was said earlier, there's a huge amount of sort of self-aggrandizement and fantasy in those books. And I think there are reasons why he wanted to make himself out to be a more sort of, well, sort of closer to the center of MI6 than he actually was. But he talked about the fact that he turned up for the trial the day before for a rehearsal, and his script was there. And they said, these are your lines. And he said, I can't learn them by tomorrow because there's like a script this big. So he said, and this sort of, I actually totally believe this. He said that they had to adjust the doc, the sort of witness box, so that he could read the script that he was told with his answers. And, you know, we've seen, you know, even now when you see people on trial in those, and there's no jury in Russian courtrooms even now, and you sort of see the sort of staged and formal atmosphere. It still exists today. But anyway, they were in that trial together for a few days, but I seen evidence that they did actually see one another in prison. I mean, Wynne was moved around a lot. He was actually moved around back and forth from different prisons. But yeah, I think they caught a glimpse of one another. But we sort of fictionalized it because we needed a sort of redemptive moment between the two of them, you know, towards the end.
On a much more, did Benedict Cumberbatch lose all that weight?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. They both, we stopped shooting for 3 months. And then we came back and did the very last sequence, very last scenes over quite a short period of time. Yeah, but he was on a sort of, both of them on these sort of crash diets, strictly supervised. And when I saw Benedict, when we came back to shoot, I was actually guilty. I felt guilty because he looked, I mean, it wasn't just the weight loss, but it's what it does to you. It sort of completely changed his whole sort of energy level. And, you know, the great thing was that is true. I mean, if you see, you know, Greville Wynne was quite a small, shorter guy, but quite stocky. And when he emerged from prison, he was absolutely skeletal. And I think the sort of trauma was written all over him. The little clip that you see at the end when he was at the airport and he'd arrived, he can barely sort of take in the questions. I think there's someone deeply, deeply traumatized. And it wasn't just the starvation he was put through. He was sort of tortured. He was put through hell in there. And so I think it paid off because it sort of shows the sort of depths of it and how impossible.
You told us a little bit about Benedict's.
That, and he did sort of carry on. Yeah.
No, I was saying you told us a tiny bit. We have a little glitch. You told us a little bit about Benedict's strategy on making the prison scene seem so real. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, he was very keen to sort of experience as much of it for real as he possibly could. So that opening shot where he comes into the prison and he's sort of taken in and taken out of his clothes and all of that was done with it was just one camera, handheld camera. And he didn't want to go into the prison until he was on camera. So he set the whole scene up with a double, and we prepared the shot, worked out what we were going to do, spent quite a long time rehearsing, and then we brought him in with a blindfold and just did it. And it was quite shocking. So he was reacting and seeing it all for the first time, and that's what he wanted. He likes that kind of stuff. He wanted to be freezing cold. He wanted to be, you know, sort of, you know, he wanted real rain, and he wanted to have his head shaved live on screen and all that. We did it all for real.
Well, where were you? And folks want to know, where were you shooting? Was that Moscow? Was that prison in Russia?
I don't think, you know why? I don't think they'd ever allowed us to shoot this film in Moscow, because Penkovsky's still seen as a traitor there, and they haven't revised their sort of hugely propagandized version of the story that the Soviet state put out afterwards, because they were so hugely embarrassed that someone at that level had given that many, 5,000 documents there were. So they had to sort of cover the whole thing up and defame him and lie about him. And that stuck. So I didn't know they allowed us there. We shot the first half in London and the second half in Prague. When I say half, I mean of the shooting schedule. In fact, there are scenes that are set in London that are shot in Prague, and there are scenes that are set in Moscow and shot in London. But most of the time, Prague stands in for for Moscow, and then there's some CGI of real Moscow in there as well. Yeah.
And now we have the question we got before, we got it during, we know it's coming. Emily Donovan, the wonderful Rachel Brosnahan, she does a terrific job, but all of the spy buffs know that that was George Kiesevalter, I believe. It was two CIA gentlemen, but there was a woman in this, but not to Emily Donovan's level. So I don't know, Jonna, Andrew, either one of you want to talk about Janet, and then we'll let Dominic tell us how the men became Emily. We knew it was coming and it came.
As a woman in espionage, when I watched it, it jolted me. I recognize, why you did it, and I think it came off rather well. She's standing in for CIA, for a team from CIA that was supporting that operation, but a team that was unable to support it on their own. They were partnering with the Brits, so it was complicated. Women back then had a difficult time, feet on the ground overseas at CIA, and that has continued through the years. It's the one place where the women still have to work a little harder than the men to do exactly the same thing. So the fact that Janet Chisholm, the British woman, received drops from Penkovsky, that was an initial approach to this face-to-face. They would go to diplomatic functions. Penkovsky had a reason to be there. Janet Chisholm, who was the wife of a British MI6 officer, she had a reason to be there, and they would just do these little exchanges at diplomatic functions. They thought it was above suspicion, and maybe it was. But then they went out on the street and had a couple of meetings, and there was so much surveillance in Moscow then. Oleg Kalugin says there were 50,000 KGB officers in Moscow at one time. And she was evidently sighted going into an apartment building that a foreign diplomat should not go into. They just stumbled across her, and the thing just started unraveling. That's all it took, was one anomaly, one out of step, one thing that looked even slightly suspicious, and they caught him. Scary place to work. Still a scary place to work.
And just really quickly before we go on to Dominic, there's a great new book out now I'm looking forward to reading called Spies, Lies and Exile. And it's all about, it's a biography of George Blake. But we think that George Blake had already told the KGB that Janet Chisholm wasn't just, the wife of an MI6 officer, but she was involved in all of this stuff. So yeah, I just thought I would add that in as a kind of NB.
Isn't it interesting that that's never really been resolved? That's the smoke and mirrors and the thing that's always up in the air. Yeah.
So Dominic, over to you. What led to the creation of, here's a two-pronged question about this. Why wouldn't you use Greville Wynne's books as sources, but you would create Emily Donovan? So those are two threads.
I think when you're doing anything that's a sort of dramatization of real events, you're sort of trying to, you've got a foot in both camps. So one foot is in sort of honoring, at the very least, the spirit of what happened, because you can't really honor the letter of it, because you've got 2 hours to turn a 16-month operation into some sort of coherent piece of drama. And the other thing is that you've got to sort of be true to, you've got to be true to the sort of need of the story to work. And I suppose we felt, first of all, that because there was a woman who was very important in the story, that we couldn't get into the Janet Chisholm story. Actually, I find it really fascinating. It's probably a whole other movie. And if we hadn't have sort of made the decision to put this sort of friendship right at the center of the movie, we might have had a space for it, but there just wasn't a space. So there was a woman in this story that sort of was important, albeit in a very different area. as you say, the wife of a British diplomat. And then we also had to compress the 2 CIA officers anyway into one, because just the necessity of function and screen time, you just don't have the time to give to 2 secondary characters like that. So you're compressing on one end, and then we thought, well, actually, let's accentuate the difference between CIA and MI6 in their whole style and their whole way of being, and sort of honor that female presence in the story. So that's how we did it. But the exciting thing about it was it offered up these sort of parallels the main story, because she has to sort of use subterfuge herself in order to get the guys to take her seriously. So there's a whole sort of strategic element to her behavior, which is basically pretending to be less smart than she is, so that the guys will think that everything she suggests is their idea. And I think there's something really great about that. So it is poetic license. There is poetic license, as there is in other areas, but I hope we've sort of been true to the spirit of what happened when we couldn't be true to the absolute detail of it.
Yeah, we another question somebody asked is about, we sort of tipped the hat towards George Blake here, but who are you thinking of in the movie when you show, you know, a British intelligence officer tipping off the Soviets? Was that?
You know what? I can't remember. Really sorry to say, I finished shooting this movie at the end of 2018. And I can't remember. But I mean, listen, there's a huge amount of speculation about how the KGB got onto this. And as Jonna just said, it's most likely that it was the surveillance around Janet Chisholm, because they were doing these dead drops in sort of doorways and sort of stuff that seemed to be sort of really open in the street. And there's also a huge amount of speculation about how long they knew what was going on, and that's never really been resolved as far as I understand, because there is a school of thought that says those photographs that Andrew showed were taken after he was arrested, and they were actually staged photographs, because what they wanted to do was try and make out that it was a whole sort of complex where they were trying to catch him out, and you know, they knew what was going on, because the really big issue for the Russian state, the Soviet state, and the KGB, and people were fired because of this. And in fact, Khrushchev was one of the reasons Khrushchev lost his role as the premier, was that you know, they didn't actually have a handle on it at all, and they let it happen for a long time, and then no one really knew. So there's a lot of speculation about that. So it is a kind of, you know, it's a kind of bit of speculation really, because you know, it could have also leaked out from double agents within MI6, and that was that was the idea. But I can't remember whether or who it was based on someone concrete. I have to ask Tom O'Connor about that.
There were so many levels of misinformation in Moscow. There was a story that floated out after all of this, that he wasn't actually executed, that he was fed alive into a crematorium.
Right, yeah.
And the idea behind that was to deter anybody else from thinking of spying against the motherland, you know, and that story floats around even today. I don't know.
Our scene of execution was of the previous guy.
Yeah.
Ian was originally going to be done like that, and we decided that it was sort of too graphic and too extreme at that point in the story, and there was so much speculation about whether it actually happened. But yes, I've heard that too. Yeah.
How did you decide, Dominic, what things to, you know, recreate as scenes and when to use actual historical footage?
Well, the only real footage we used was the very end, the little bit of Greville Wynne that we put in, which actually was not in the script. And we put it in very late into the post-production process. And I'm glad we did. I mean, it's a sort of almost a cliche now, isn't it? If you do something based on a real character, that you show the real characters at the end. But actually it was partly, I thought it was particularly useful in this instance because I feel like that little clip shows so much of what he went through. He's sort of blinking in the lights and in the most sort of terrible state. So yeah. But generally, I mean, the thing is, if you tell a real story, and this is not just about the world of espionage, if you're telling a story, or even if you're adapting a novel where you have too much material, what the crucial sort of editorial decision is, what is your story? You know, because there are 20, 30 versions of this story we could have told.
Right.
And the story we decided to tell was sort of about this relationship, about this friendship. And I think when you read the Greville Wynne sort of highly fictionalized autobiographies, there are two things that really ring true. One is the prison experience, which just has a sort of graphic level of detail that no one could have made up. And the sort of inner battle, psychology that helped him to survive sort of the constant bombardment from the KGB. And the second thing is his incredible admiration for Penkovsky, which just radiates out of every page. He absolutely thought this guy was the bee's knees. And I mean, they sort of clicked as friends. And I think, as Andrew put it, is absolutely right, that there was a sort of mutual sense of grievance at the world, that they were sort of outsiders that hadn't been recognized. But I think also there was a sense of sort of kinship and profound sort of, I think the fact they were taking these risks together and they were involved in this mission without anyone understanding or knowing what they were going through intensified their friendship. And I think it was, unusual, because he was a rookie. He didn't have the detachment that I suppose a lot of professionals would have had. And it's almost like he sort of had a crush on Penkovsky, and that became for us sort of one of the really interesting elements of the story that we decided to put at the center. And once you make that decision, you sort of go, right, this is it. We're not doing this. We're not doing that, and you start to shape it around that spine. And there are just as many legitimate other ways into this story, because it's an incredible story, and there's another 5 movies at least that one could make about it.
Yeah, someone wants to know if there's a director's cut with all sorts of things.
There's loads of stuff taken out. The first cut was nearly 3 hours long. But I think if you get the DVD, you'll be able to see some of the DVD will come out, I don't know, in the early summer, and there's going to be quite a lot of cut scenes in there, so you can see them for yourself.
This is the audience for that.
Right.
And this is also the audience to ask Jonna a couple of spycraft questions. I'm going to roll them into a ball. Jonna, how did you think that Emily Donovan, her tradecraft was when she was trying to get in the black, to get a hold of, to communicate with Penkovsky? And are one-time pads ever broken by either side?
I'll answer your 2 questions if you'll let me ask one at the end.
It's a deal.
Her tradecraft was great. It was what we teach. It was if you're in a moving crowd and they're following you, they're not following your face. They're following your hat. They're following your umbrella. They're following your profile. And if you can break that up, put the umbrella down, take off the hat, and move, you can probably walk away from your surveillance. It's one of the ways to do it. You need a crowd to do that. The second question was about
one-time pads. Do those ever get broken?
If you use them more than one time, they do. And that's how the Poles got into the German Enigma machine during the Second World War. The Germans were so confident in their Enigma, and it was like a miracle machine, that they just they broke their own rules and they used those one-time pads, and that's all it takes. That's all it took. That's all it takes. My question was for Dominic, and the question is, if you look at today's prison system in Moscow and you look at Navalny in there, and we know what he's going through, plus throw a hunger strike on top of it, what do you think? You think this movie will have any impact worldwide on this? I mean, this system, this Russian system that is still there with the fake trials and.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, one of the tragedies, and there are many tragedies of perestroika, not in itself, but the way it was sort of executed, was that so many of the sort of deeper structural issues of the Soviet state, the corruption, were not sort of revised and rethought. And the legal system, the judicial system, should have been completely overhauled, because you cannot have democracy without the rule of law. You just can't have it. So if you try and make democracy just by introducing a ballot box, that's not going to do it for you. And equally, I think very crucially in Russia is the sort of education system, which for decades and decades, children were taught to sort of be blindly loyal to the Soviet state, and it was not revised. Now, there are many, many failings of the education system in the West, in all our countries, but the idea, the principle of sort of teaching children to think for themselves, to be inquiring, to ask questions, is about as far away as you can get from the Russian model. And I think it's sort of tragedy that what happened in the end was that a sort of neoliberal economic system was enforced on the Russians by the World Bank, and very little was done to actually sort of really think about, well, how do you make a country into a democracy that has never been a democracy? It doesn't have it. I mean, the Czech Republic had been way back, so it's sort of in their bones. So it is a real problem. And ironically, our wonderful casting director, Nina Gold, her husband spent 2 years in a Russian prison because he was one of the Greenpeace protesters that was arrested. I don't know whether you remember that. Sort of tried to jump onto an oil rig or something, and they got arrested, and she had to spend 2 years of her life trying to get him out of that prison. And actually, this was only, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, something like that. And his experience was not dissimilar to Greville Wynne's. I mean, he wasn't sort of interrogated to that degree, but he was sort of starved, and it was brutal, absolutely brutal. So yeah, it is. And the Navalny situation is desperate. It's heartbreaking. Yeah.
Can I just jump in for 1 second? If just when I looked at Greville Wynne's books, and you were talking about his searing experience, in prison, it reminded me, if anybody's looking for a reading recommendation for COVID, Dostoevsky's Memoirs from the House of the Dead, which also ties into this question of the penal system and Russian history. Anyway, moving quickly on.
Was Penkovsky, I'm going to try to do easy ones. Was Penkovsky poisoned? Was that poisoning real? Was that poetic license?
No, that happened. That happened. They cleared him out of his apartment and poisoned him and put surveillance in. That was what my understanding was. And in fact, the surveillance was really intense. They moved people out of the apartment upstairs so they could sort of drill through the ceiling. The question was how far back did that go? And I mean, I sort of favor the view that they completely screwed up. And the reason I favor that view is, I mean, I'm not a historian, but I'm just sort of reading between the lines, is that the show trial and the efforts to defame and cover up what happened was so extreme that you think, well, what's that about? Why were they so desperate to hide the fact that they had made a mistake? Because they made a mistake. I mean, I think, and the fact is, even if they were watching him for like a month or 2 months, I mean, the fact is that the volume of material he passed over to the West was so damaging for them that, it had already become a huge embarrassment. And, Penkovsky was well known. He sort of had a public profile because he was a military hero, and military heroes were celebrated in the Soviet Union. And that was a problem for them. He was married to a incredibly sort of high status woman. He had in his sort of social circle with some of the most important people in the Soviet Union at that time. So it was a huge embarrassment for many, many people that they were associated with what to many Russian people is the absolute worst thing any human being could do, which is to betray Mother Russia. It was a massive event. So they really went to great lengths to make sure that the Russian public believed their version of events.
All right, Dominic, this is a question we ask you in private, so it's only fair to ask you in public. Will you make more spy movies? Because we liked it.
Listen, one day, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's in the right situation. I mean, I am really fascinated by Russian history. It's always really interested me. I studied it at school. I've continued to be interested. I've gone to Russia quite a lot in more recent years. And there's something about the failure of that system and its idealism, those sort of massive contradictions, and the both the sort of glory of Russia as a country, as a sort of country of extraordinary achievement, as a country of amazing artists, and a wonderful sort of spirit, because I've met so many brilliant people. People have been incredibly hospitable to me in Russia, and sort of you have amazing experiences there with this sort of devastatingly cruel system that continues to prevail in its own way now is an extraordinary sort of conundrum, and something that really interests me. So I can absolutely see myself doing something set there, and whether it's sort of, if you do anything set there, it's got these sort of elements to it, because it's a country that is full of you know, secrets still to this day.
Well, we're going to let Dominic go to bed. It's rather late where he is, but he has been such a great sport to be with us. It's been a huge pleasure. And Jonna, you're always amazing resource. And Andrew, my friend, that someday I'll get to work with sitting next to each other instead of through our Zoom boxes. You are a treasure. And to our wonderful friends at the Round Robin Bar, maybe Dominic will come visit us in DC sometime.
Oh, I would love that.
Wouldn't that be fun?
I'd love that.
So I want to thank all of our guests for coming a little bit early. That was so we didn't make, Dominic stay up till 1 a.m. Thanks everyone for joining us. This was an incredible opportunity from Lionsgate and Roadside Attraction to see the movie and talk to the director. Please share with your friends what a great film this is, and please go see it and buy it whenever it's available. And if you like the Ye Old Spy team, we're always happy for a charitable donation. This keeps us able to offer free programs like tonight's. And if you want to know what's happening in today's world, at 12 Eastern time tomorrow, at noon tomorrow, we will have our spy chat, and you can find out not what was happening during the Cold War, which is still reverberating, but what's happening right now from our executive director. And we have a great guest, Ellen McCarthy, tomorrow. And that is free, because we like to educate you and enlighten you. And we also like to have fun. And we hope you've experienced all of that tonight. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you again, Dominic.
Lovely. Thanks so much. I've so enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Pleasure.